You're listening to Secrets of the Royals, a podcast about the tragedies that befell the royal family. And we're your hosts, journalists and royal experts, Kerry and Maria. Hi, welcome to Secrets of the Royals with myself, Kerry.
And Maria.
We're two journalists who are also old friends.
Very old friends.
Who have worked for many years on newspapers and magazines, and we share a passion for royal content. So together we edit the Royal List newsletter over on Substack, which we'd love to have you join us.
Yeah, please do. We've got a great community of followers and we'd love you to be on board.
So in this series, we're talking about royal tragedies. And in this episode, we're talking all about the very dashing, handsome Prince William, the other Prince William.
Yes, we are indeed. And he's largely forgotten about, isn't he?
He is. He's largely forgotten to history, which I always find really surprising that when you listen to this tragic tale and what a remarkable young man he was, why he is all but forgotten.
Yeah, so, I mean, I'll just give a brief top line about his life. He was the angels aligned when he was born. He was a beautiful, handsome man and died tragically at the age of 30 in an air disaster in an air show near Wolverhampton. He was a qualified pilot and very much like the present day Prince William, passionate about flying, gorgeously handsome, charted his own course with a very independent life and fell in love with a beautiful woman as well. But on the 28th of August, 1972, disaster happened, and that's when fate stepped in and changed everything, and he lost his life tragically. But before we get onto that, we'll talk a bit about him. But yeah, it's really odd that the whole thing didn't even make a subplot of The Crown, did it?
No, that is a whole other episode. We could talk about that.
It really is.
What didn't make stories on The Crown, including my personal bugbear, was that Princess Anne's kidnapping attempt didn't make a plot at all. And it's not like Princess Anne didn't appear in The Crown, because she did all the way through, stuffed into scenes where she was miraculously having tea just so she could be shocked about something that had happened. But
yes,
then they missed out this really important part of her life. However, we digress.
But we could do a whole episode on that sort of thing.
So tell me about Prince. Who was he? Who was Prince William?
So the lovely Prince William. He was born on the 18th of December, 1941. He was a war baby, and his dad was Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who was the brother of the then King George VI.
That makes William cousin to the late Queen.
Yes, he was a first cousin to the princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. And at the time of his birth, he was fourth in line to the throne.
So he was quite, I think what people have to remember also that back then, the line of succession had been flip-flopping, because obviously the late Queen had never expected to be Queen. So her father only became king because Edward, his brother, abdicated. So being fourth in the line of succession was fairly high up.
Yeah, incredibly high up. And even at the time of his death in 72, he was still ninth in line of succession. So he was a very much loved member of the royal family and very close to his cousin Elizabeth and Margaret, and very close to his parents. And a fascinating young man. And they let him off the leash quite a lot. He was able to go and do his own thing, which we'll discuss. His mother, Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester, they'd married quite late. She was 35 when she married his dad, and she had a few miscarriages. So he was a much yearned-for baby when he was born in 41. And his brother Richard followed a couple of years after that. And his dad bought a place called Barnwell Manor in Northamptonshire, a lovely country estate that his mother had known from childhood. And they kind of had an idyllic life, despite the war and everything, in Barnwell Manor. But just after the war, in 1945, which our Australian followers will probably know of, his dad was made Governor General, and they went over to Australia from 1945 to 1947, I believe.
Yeah, when he was Governor General. Now, as an aside for anyone that listens to another episode of our podcast, hopefully everybody.
Yeah.
So Prince George was William's uncle and his father's brother.
Yes.
Prince George had been destined to be the Governor General of Australia, but he had also died in an air crash.
Yeah, spookily, 30 years before William.
So hence that's why his father then became Governor General.
Yes.
And then interestingly, there was some suggestion that Prince Harry might have been Governor General. It was on the table as an option.
So they're negotiating their new royal kind of life.
It was put on the table, but I'm a dual Australian citizen.
Oh yes, you are.
So I personally don't think that would have ever come to pass from an Australian's point of view. But it's interesting that it did get mooted.
Yeah. And anyway, back to
this Prince William. So tell us.
Yes, so
about
they had a lovely
childhood.
time. Yeah, so they eventually came back to the UK in 1947, just in time for his cousin's marriage, his wedding, to Philip.
Yes.
So little William, who was nearly 6, was Princess Elizabeth's page boy at the wedding, alongside his other first cousin, who is Prince Michael of Kent. And at the time, he was only 5. And there are some lovely, cute pictures of both of them in the official shots. So if anybody wants to look those up, they're really sweet. And yeah, you can see at the time that William was a beautiful looking kid. He had icy blue eyes. Yeah, he also was quite a bright little boy as well.
He went to Eton, didn't he?
Yeah, so he was sent to Eton, where a lot of the royals did go. He excelled at cricket and football and his academic studies, and then went up to Cambridge to read history.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and I think he was at Cambridge from 60 to 63. Had a great time there. His doting mum used to send tuck boxes down to him at Cambridge, probably via the family chauffeur, which I've read before. And yeah, after that, he achieved another MA in 1968, but he also spent a year in California.
Oh, really?
Where did he go? He went to Stanford University to read political science for a year.
That's really fascinating, isn't it? That's not a path that many other royals have followed.
No, he was incredibly bright, and all his friends said, not only was he bright and fun to be with, he was also very loyal. He was warm and tender, and he was not one for sort of royal protocol. So he really downplayed his royal status. And I guess, it was the swinging 60s as well, wasn't it? So he wanted to just be one of the boys, maybe.
And he was a bit of a daredevil, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a daredevil. So during his time at Cambridge, he obviously had a childhood passion for planes, and he joined the flying club at Cambridge, and then became a qualified pilot. He put in his hours, gained his wings. He also took up the hobby of hot air ballooning, which, you do. So he was quite an expert balloonist. He was an incredibly good skier. And later on, in his late 20s, he was like president of the National Federation of Ski Supporters.
Wow.
So, and he loved exploring too. He was quite passionate about Africa, which kind of echoes back down the line to our own William, who's very, very fond of Africa, obviously. And he went hiking in the Sahara at one point.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. So I believe there's a BBC documentary somewhere in the archives which shows this Prince William on a hike during the Sahara Desert. So yeah, he was. I read somewhere that he was called the James Bond of the royal family because he was such a daredevil and a bit of a risk taker.
Yeah.
So yes, that was his kind of,
which very much aligns with the young princes William and Harry, with their action man and the love of flying. And Harry had an Arctic expedition, didn't he?
Yes, where he famously had frostbite his.
Oh well, let's
not go there.
That was a little detail I don't think any of us possibly expected or necessarily needed in Spare. Possibly if I was editing it, I would have advised him to chop that bit out. Thank you to our hotel partner, the Soho Hotel, where we recorded this episode. In the heart of London's Soho, this gorgeous hotel is a favourite destination of Kerry's. Book at firmdalehotels.com. So he's a young man, he's graduated, he's starting out in his career. Where are we now?
So we're he's about 25, very much not wanting to take up his royal duties yet.
Right.
But he was strongly supported by his parents in this. And yeah, he decided, this is another curveball and was seen as a kind of maverick choice, to join the civil service.
Right, and so he goes to the High Commission, doesn't he?
Yeah, so his first posting was off to Nigeria, where he worked in the British High Commission in Lagos for a couple of years.
Right.
Until 1968, I believe. And then had a posting to Tokyo.
Right, so he's off to Tokyo to the High Commission there. And what happens there?
Yeah, well, interestingly though, before he went to Tokyo, he just had to have a medical. And this is where an interesting kind of
historical illness,
genetic
hereditary illness pops up from the family.
So. Genetic condition comes. Yes. He'd been complaining since about 1965 when he was 24, 25 that he'd had a couple of bouts of jaundice, and also he'd suffered from blistering skin rashes if he was out in the sunshine. So yes, they did a few tests and discovered that he had the same genetic skin condition that led that George III and Mary Queen of Scots apparently suffered from, and it's called porphyria. If that's how you say it.
Yeah, so it's a condition that, is that right, that if you go into the sun, your skin can get very sensitive?
Yeah, very sensitive and erupts into, quite painful blisters and rashes.
And redness. And,
yeah.
As well as other
conditions, other symptoms.
Yeah.
But fortunately for him, it was controllable, and subsequent examinations proved he was in remission. But it's just an interesting sideline that, this royal illness came down through the generations.
I wonder if anybody still suffers from it.
Yeah, that's true.
So he's off to Tokyo.
Yeah, so, Tokyo, working in the British Embassy. And interestingly, he sort of helped pilot himself across to Tokyo.
I remember reading that fact a long time ago and being absolutely fascinated by it. A royal, because a lot's made of Prince Philip flying, and that it was,
flying.
and wasn't it dangerous that certainly if you watch The Crown, that was an episode where, it was seen as like a bit of maverick behaviour and a bit dangerous that he was flying himself all over. And then that actually Prince William flew himself to his job in Tokyo. It's fabulous.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah. So over there, this is where he fell madly in love.
Oh, so
with a Hungarian divorced mother. She had a daughter, and she was working over there as a flight attendant and a model. And they had mutual friends. And at a party, he went up to her and quite sweetly just said, "May I have this dance, my Cinderella?"
My Cinderella.
Yeah. Okay. And she said, because she spoke about it, in the years to come, that he always called her Cinderella.
And what was her name?
Her name was Zsuzsi Starkloff.
With lots of Z's.
Yes, Susie with a Z. And she was 5 years older than him, incredibly gorgeous and vivacious, and also very bright. And they were totally smitten with each other. And so much so that it is written that this romance ruffled a few feathers back at home, in the corridors in the palaces. But I don't believe it was, was that much sort of frowned upon as maybe poor Margaret was with
But didn't he take relationship advice from Princess Margaret?
Yeah, so yes, of all people, he did. Yeah, so she came over to Tokyo in 1969. She was part of a royal envoy, a diplomatic trade offensive, and obviously met with her, very close cousin. And Zsuzsi said she did meet her, and she was incredibly lovely to her and kind and pleasant. But she did advise William, just to take things easy, and also, to come back home eventually and see how things look, but also, but to follow your heart. And it was supposedly the advice that she brought on behalf of Queen Elizabeth.
Because Zsuzsi was, not only was she divorced, wasn't she Catholic?
Yes, yeah. So she wasn't really ticking all the royal boxes for the perfect bride.
So they didn't get married?
No, sadly no. Although she did visit his parents in Barnwell Manor in 1970. That was the year their relationship ended. And she said they were all very kind to her. But I think William just realised that maybe, he never married. And he also gave an interview to the Sunday Mirror in the year of his death in 1972, saying that if he ever was to get married, it would have to be the right woman for him, but also the right woman for other members of the family.
Oh dear.
So even though he was independent, had an independent streak, he had a very keen sense of duty. And so, you know, he was very respectful.
She didn't get over him, did she?
No. So sadly, she never married either, never married again. She went off to live in America and became a pilot and ran her own flying school.
And didn't she have his ring? Was that right?
So she became a pilot because he always encouraged her to fly, and she did it as a tribute to him. But also he gave her, she had a signet ring that was engraved with a W that he gave her, and she wore it on a chain as a necklace for the rest of her life. Oh. So that was really sad. Yes. Yeah.
So we're now getting towards the actual, the tragic death. So tell me about the air show and what happened.
Yeah, well, it's all, you know, incredibly sad and a terrible accident, because he was an incredibly experienced pilot. He'd been involved in numerous air races over the last few years. He'd moved back to Britain, obviously, in 1970 because his father had been ill. He was in failing health. He was incapacitated. He said to friends, "It's my job now. It's my job now to be a royal prince." He took on more, you know, engagements for his cousin, the Queen. But he also, you know, flew in more air races. And this one was just another one, you know. He flew up in the morning.
What date are we at?
Oh, we're now 28th of August, 1972.
So just as a little aside, awful tragedies for the royal family. There seems to be a lot of them at the end of August. It seems to be a really bad luck
They have a real curse around this time.
Yeah. Obviously, Diana died at the end of August. Anybody listening to the rest of this series will see a pattern of deaths at the end of August. So it's the end of August.
Yeah.
In an air show. Everything seems to be, there's, you know, fine.
Yeah, hunky-dory. He's already done a fly-through. He did a one trial run of the course. He was with his co-pilot and friend, Viral Mitchell, who was going to be flying with him. They took off, but almost 20 seconds into the flight, they took off. They were flying at low altitude, and he was banking sharply because the air course, it was part of that, where they all had to bank sharply, then they follow this course. But the investigators believe he was doing that at very high acceleration, trying to miss a whole row of trees. And unfortunately, his wing clipped a tree, sheared off, plane lost control and just flipped over. They came plunging to the ground and just burst into flames on impact. They were instantly killed, and you know, there were 30,000 people at this event
watching. That's terrible.
It was the Goodyear International Air Trophy. They were watching. It was just horrendous. 3 young local boys talked about trying to get to them and release them from the cockpit, but they couldn't. They were beaten back by the flames, and it took a couple of hours to put the fire out. And sadly and awful, the next day they were identified by their dental records.
Dreadful. Just
dreadful tragedy.
So what was the aftermath for the royal family?
Yeah, well, at the time, the context that it was the 1972 Munich Olympics, so Prince Philip was already over there. The Queen and Princess Anne were due to go over there. Obviously, they didn't. The family were in mourning. Obviously, Prince Philip came back, and his funeral was held at St. George's Chapel
in Windsor.
And another tragic twist to it all is that because his father was so ill, his heartbroken mother, in her memoir, said that she never, I know it might sound shocking, but she never told her husband that his, you know, firstborn son had been killed. Although she said she suspects he might have known from the TV coverage.
What a terrible thing. Yeah. What a terrible thing for her to cope with.
Yeah. And she said at the time, you know, she was never the same again. No. But she said she had to learn to think, well, it was better to have known and loved him than not to have known him at all. She wrote in her memoir. And so they are now all buried together at Frogmore. He's with his mum and dad. His dad died 2 years later in 1974.
Yeah.
And then obviously his younger brother is now our present day Duke of Gloucester.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
So the other question is, was the current Prince William, do we think he was named in honour?
Yes. Yeah. There's always speculation about this, and I've been digging around, and I really couldn't find any substantive evidence to say he was definitely named after William. And also in Morton's book, Diana in Her Own Words, she does refer to the process of naming William when he was born, and how Charles was set on calling him Arthur. And she just thought, oh my gosh, no, it's terribly old-fashioned. I'm not having my child called. So she was insisting on William. So I kind of think it was a happy coincidence, maybe, that she loved that name so much. And Charles, obviously, he really, adored his older cousin, really admired his daredevil ways. Obviously Charles became a bit of an action man himself. So and eventually, William was christened William Arthur Philip Louis. So I just think maybe it all aligned and it worked out in the end. But yes.
Well, I'm sure that there was a nod to his other tragic relative. But yeah, what a fascinating story. Thank
I know.
You.
Well, thanks. But yes, and I think everyone should go and have a look at just how lovely this young man was. He was he was such an interesting royal, and a real loss to the family. Sad tale. But yeah, thanks for being with us on this journey.
Until next time.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, do share with your friends and subscribe to the Royal List newsletter over on Substack.